Our New Testament reading is found in the Gospel of Matthew, chapter 25, beginning at verse 31. When the Son of Man comes in his glory and all his angels with him, then he will sit on the throne of his glory. All the nations will be gathered before him, and he will separate people one from another as a shepherd separates the sheep from the goats. And he will put the sheep at his right hand and the goats at the left. Then the king will say to those at his right hand, "Come, you that are blessed by my Father, inherit the kingdom prepared for you from the foundation of the world. For I was hungry, and you gave me food. I was thirsty, and you gave me something to drink. I was a stranger, and you welcomed me. I was naked, and you gave me clothing. I was sick, and you took care of me. I was in prison, and you visited me." Then the righteous will answer him, "Lord, when was it that we saw you hungry and gave you food, or thirsty and gave you something to drink? And when was it that we saw you a stranger and welcomed you, or naked and gave you clothing? And when was it that we saw you sick or in prison and visited you?" And the king will answer them, "Truly, I tell you, just as you did it to one of the least of these who are members of my family, you did it to me." Then he will say to those at his left hand, "You that are accursed, depart from me into the eternal fire prepared for the devil and his angels. For I was hungry, and you gave me no food. I was thirsty, and you gave me nothing to drink. I was a stranger, and you did not welcome me, naked, and you did not give me clothing, sick, and in prison, and you did not visit me." Then they also will answer, "Lord, when was it that we saw you hungry or thirsty or a stranger or naked or sick or in prison and did not take care of you?" Then he will answer them, "Truly I tell you, just as you did not do it to one of the least of these, you did not do it to me." And these will go away into eternal punishment, but the righteous into eternal life. This is the word of the Lord. Thanks be to God. I'm going to tell you a story that some of you will remember because I've shared it with you before. But for some of you, many of you, I think, it will be brand new. I'm going to tell you a true story. It's about a man named Jim, and that's his real name. And I'm using it because once upon a time, Jim gave me permission to tell his story. I met Jim, I'm not exactly sure where, but at a certain time in my life, Jim was sort of everywhere. When I looked out my window, there would be Jim rolling his shopping cart down Lathrop Avenue and coming up on my porch to pick up a bag I had left there for him. Jim was a small guy, perhaps in his 60s when we met, but he looked much, much older. He was wiry and sort of bent over, and he didn't have a lot of his original teeth left. He had a pack-a-day habit of these really nasty little cigars. They smelled just vile. I am not sure whether it was the smoking that aged Jim or the drinking. Jim had a long, hard career of drinking. But that was behind him now. When I knew him, he was in recovery, the stalwart of a downtown Wednesday 6 p.m. AA meeting. He was so proud of his recovery. First, he counted the days, and then the months, and then the years. I was invited to go to the meetings where Jim received his 10, 11, and 12-year medallions. When I first knew Jim, he was walking around the neighborhood, miles and miles of walking every day, to pick up cans and bottles, those that he'd pick out of the garbage or the recycling, and those he'd get off the porches of friends who saved them for him. I was in the latter category. For a long time, it was years, I'm not sure how many, all my returnable bottles and cans went to Jim. It was convenient for me, no hauling them to the grocery store, and it was money Jim lived on. He was on disability because of his health. He got a Social Security check each month. But the thing that allowed Jim to live in his little apartment on Walnut Street was collecting bottles and cans. Jim kept track of his bottles and cans the way he kept track of his sobriety. Every once in a while, he'd give me a call, and he'd ask me to drive him and a whole load of returnables to the can man. And so I'd go, and we'd load them in the back of my car. Not everyone rinses out cans and bottles, so inevitably my car would end up smelling like a brewery. It struck me as odd, maybe even tempting fate, just a tiny bit, that Jim lived off bottles and cans, given that beer almost killed him. But it never seemed to bother him. Maybe the cigars had killed his sense of smell, I don't know. But Jim, when we were driving to the Redemption Center, would say, well, last year I got all the way to $1,800, and it was a slow summer for some reason. I'm only at $1,200 this year, and it's already Labor Day. But I think I can make it this year if the kids, that's what he called our local college students, the kids, if the kids have as many parties as they did last fall. To tell you the truth, I did not always look forward to driving Jim to the Redemption Center. I would get a message from him in my answering machine, and I would think, oh, great, just what I need this week. I hated the smell in my car, and my kids were young, so I had to make sure someone was available to watch them because we had to put the back down in my station wagon to fit all the cans in. It was kind of a pain in the neck. But then I'd be with Jim in his presence, driving to the Redemption Center, and inevitably my mood would change for the better. Jim had this incredible optimism about him. I would watch him walk. I would see how hard it was for him. His joints were painful. He had emphysema. I don't think I've mentioned that yet. Eventually, he was pulling an oxygen tank along with him. He'd get winded just going up a set of 3 steps. Here he was, this guy, living alone in his tiny apartment, living off Social Security and his can and bottle money, in physical pain pretty much all the time, and he was simply one of the most optimistic and grateful people I have ever known. That was it. Jim was grateful. He was sober. He had that to be grateful about. He was able not to drink one day at a time, as he often reminded me, and in recent years, he had become interested in genealogy, so he spent a lot of time calling people, churches, cemeteries, trying to track down his ancestors. And he had a fully fleshed out family tree going back into the 16th century. He was incredibly excited about his family history, and it gave him an opportunity to talk to people. He was in a lot of pain, but he could still walk. He was grateful for that. He loved those dreadful, smelly cigars. He was grateful whenever he had a pack of those. Jim was just grateful. Jim was a church-going man. That's the other place I saw him. I was the director of youth ministry and Christian education for a downtown church, and Jim was a member. So I would see him there. I'd hear his shopping cart squeaking down the hallways, and I'd say, Jim's in the building. Jim could talk about his faith. He was an unusual person in that respect. He believed that God, working through AA, had saved his life. He was grateful. One fall, the youth group decided to do a fundraiser. They wanted to buy gifts for the women and children who would find themselves at the SOS shelter, now known as Rise, New York, on Christmas. And as you may know, Rise, SOS, has offered safety and advocacy for victims of domestic violence for 35 years now. I don't remember who thought of this as a mission project, but it came from a kid, and they were very pumped. This seemed like a worthwhile cause to them. They really wanted to help. One of them got the idea to do a bottle and can drive, and all the others concurred that this would be a great, relatively easy way to raise money. All they'd need to do would be to remind people at church to save bottles and cans for them, and then they'd bring them in, and voila, easy money. Now, when you're a youth leader, your best possible scenario is being able to follow where the kids are leading when they have an inspiration to do something wonderful. So I encouraged them, absolutely, we can do this. And the bulletin announcements were written, and the signs were made, and the word went out. We were collecting bottles and cans for a good cause. And I felt a little funny about this. As far as Jim was concerned, I was worried. Would we be cutting into Jim's income? I knew he depended on that money from bottles and cans. I made a mental note to hold some of our family's returnables aside for him. Maybe we could even try to drink a little extra soda for that month. I worried about the next time I would see Jim. Would he be upset? Would he be hurt? I did not look forward to our next encounter. So I was in my office one cold, gray November day. I hadn't seen Jim since the beginning of the bottle and can drive, but it was going really well. I had an appointment to meet a youth group member and his mother to take 2 carloads to the Redeemer. I don't remember what I was working at, but I'm sure I was at my computer, and then I heard it, the squeak, squeak, squeak of Jim's shopping cart coming down the hallway of the church. I took a deep breath. I had been dreading this meeting. I stood up and poked my head out my office door. "Hi," he said. He had a real raspy smoker's voice. "Can we talk in private?" "Sure, Jim," I said. "Come on in my office." He nodded and he wheeled his cart just inside my door. He ambled in sort of slowly, and then he let himself carefully down in a chair while I closed the door. "I've been meaning to talk to you about this bottle drive, Jim. You all know I do this. I try to get ahead of the thing." That was narrowly true. I had had a sense I should talk to him, but in my anxiety about hurt feelings and so forth, I had not really made any effort to make it happen. "That's what I want to talk about," Jim said. He reached into the pocket of his big parka and he pulled out a wet, wrinkled $20 bill. I looked at him blankly. "This is for the bottle drive," he said. "I want you to put it towards whatever the kids make." And then he paused. "I don't want them to know it's from me." It took me a moment to reorient myself from the conversation I had been anticipating to this conversation that I was actually having. For some reason, the first words out of my mouth were, "Jim, you don't need to do this." He looked at me hard. "Oh, yes, I do. It should be a lot more, but this is all I can manage at the moment." I did a quick calculation. $20. That's 400 cans. I had some vivid mental snapshots of Jim walking slowly down a street on the west side, of Jim climbing 3 stairs somewhere to retrieve a bag, of Jim excited and adding up the numbers as we drove to the can man. I knew exactly what those bottles and cans had cost him. "Jim," I began, but I never finished. "I have not always been the person I should have been," Jim said, "especially when I was drinking, especially where women are concerned. Just know that I need to do this." His voice brightened up as he left my office. "Have a nice day," he said, and Jim said that always completely without the tiniest note of sarcasm. He always meant it from the heart. He took hold of his cart, and I listened as its squeaky wheels rolled down the carpeted hallway. I stood there with that wet 20 between my fingers, and for the first time in my life, I believe I got it. I got what grateful giving, what grateful living looks like. Actually, it can look like a lot of things, but on that day, it looked like a little hunched man wheeling his squeaky cart down the street to collect bottles and cans that he needed to live. And a man who knew that everything he had was a gift, and that when you've been blessed, it feels good to share those blessings. Blessings be to each of you, and thanks be to God. Amen.